I'm going to call Phil Twyford.
Mr Chairman, I want to quote the Honourable Dr Nick Smith. In 2013, at the time of the first reading of the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Bill, Dr Smith said, "This bill isn't a silver bullet for the problem, but a much-needed interim measure while the government's longer-term work program to address housing affordability beds in."
The old bedding in.
So 3 years ago, this was some kind of interim measure, but now they need another 3 years while they desperately hope that the special housing areas will deliver some kind of results. Will this minister ever do anything more than the chronic piecemeal tinkering that passes for a housing policy?
No.
Will he? Will he ever do anything more than tinker around the edges? David Seymour says this bill is little more than ad hoc tinkering. Well, I agree with David Seymour on this. That's all it is, ad hoc tinkering. Let's consider some of the provisions in this bill. Clause 5 amends Section 16 of the Hasher Act, which provides for the establishment of special housing areas. New Section 16 allows an order in council to define the boundaries of an SHA, blah, blah. Clause 6 replaces Section 18 of the Hasher Act and allows SHAs to be disestablished. And then there's a whole series of criteria about disestablishment. Section 18.3 currently provides for the early disestablishment of an SHA. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. It's the product of this minister's mind, a minister who for 10 years has been blaming the RMA and blaming councils for producing an uncompetitive urban land market. He's done nothing substantial about it, and this is what he's reduced to: a bureaucratic exercise in micromanaging urban land markets. It's a massive bureaucratic exercise, with a whole lot of bureaucrats writing little lines on maps and saying you can do this, you can't do that, now it's time to do that, if you don't do this by a certain period, we're going to disestablish you. It's a Kafkaesque nightmare. Now, Minister, why don't you just actually why don't you follow through on the rhetoric that you've been spouting for 10 years and actually genuinely reform the planning process? Why don't you abolish the urban growth boundary and introduce a smarter way of managing urban growth? Why don't you protect the special environmental areas, invest in rapid transit growth to support new development, and genuinely reform infrastructure financing? But you won't. The minister won't do that. All he does is tinker. And I ask the member for Epsom, who claims to believe in competitive land markets, who wants to see the cost of urban land go down, because he understands that the high price of urban land is at the heart of the housing crisis in Auckland. Well, it's fine for the minister to nod his head like that. Yeah, he's been saying things like this for 10 years, but he's done absolutely nothing about it. And he had his chance with the draft National Policy Statement. That was his opportunity to genuinely reform the restrictive planning and zoning system that creates an artificial scarcity of land, that drives up urban land values and makes affordable housing impossible in our biggest city. The National Policy Statement was his opportunity to make change. But what did he do? He produced a draft National Policy Statement that implemented a giant bureaucratic mechanism telling councils that they had to project the future need for development land, and then if they didn't think there was enough, then they had to increase the amount of land and supply. An incremental infusion of land into a highly speculative land market. That bears no resemblance to what that minister and Bill English have been whittering on about for a decade, talking about uncompetitive land markets. What an incredible disappointment. This minister is in the twilight of his career. He's been mouthing off about reforming the planning system, driving down the cost of urban land all these years, blaming the RMA and blaming councils.
Dr. Pam G. Pam.